All right, and we are back. Drive Safe Dave, Double Check Dale, and we are sitting here in great anticipation. Have on the line Kenny Ray. I know y'all are all throwing up those heart signs on the social media, but we got Kenny Ray. How you doing out there, Kenny?
I'm doing good, Dave. And yourself?
Man, couldn't be better. A little more overweight than I would like to be, as usual, but I'm trying to work through that, and it's something I got to come to terms with.
Same here, brother.
Let me talk to you. All right, so let's talk about crash preventability determination program. I would like very much for you, Kenny, to explain what it is, what it means, and what some of the results are.
You know, Dave and Dale, a lot of times when the federal government does something, it's not always in the best interest of trucking. But this is a program they did that has been extremely, and how many extremely you want to put in that sentence, beneficial for our industry. FMCSA has always collected data on crashes, and you have to go back to their definition of a recordable accident, and it's basically a commercial motor vehicle operating on a public highway involved in a collision, and one of three things results. There's either a fatality, someone dies, or there's injuries requiring treatment away from the scene, or a vehicle must be towed due to disabling damage. If any of those things occur, that simply meets the definition of a DOT recordable crash. At that point, a motor carrier, trucking company, BCB, has to do something with that crash. And what they have to do is record it on their accident register. FMCSA also does something with that, and they post it to the carrier's profile in the SAFER system. Now, therein lies the issue. Traditionally, it just sat there and there wasn't any big deal. But now, the public has access to the data in the SAFER system. And so now, the general public, plaintiffs' attorneys, and insurance underwriters can all see that those crashes appear on a motor carrier's profile within the US DOT data system. The problem is that trucking companies never had a way to say, hey, yes, we were involved in a crash, but we had nothing to do with it. It wasn't our fault. It was non-preventable. And in the past, DOTs just turned a deaf ear to that. However, once Congress was notified of that by some trucking companies and advocacy groups, Congress said to FMCSA, y'all got to do something about this. This system isn't fair. So in July of 2017, 5 years ago, the FMCSA started a 2-year pilot program, ran from July of 17 to July of 19, and they said this, on the number eight very specific types of crashes, we will review, if a motor carrier submits a crash report, we will review that to determine, is there any way we can determine preventability versus non-preventability? During that 2-year period, FMCSA looked at 5,600 crashes that were submitted to them, 5,600. Now, you ask about results. Now, this is the pilot program from 5 years ago. FMCSA found that 94%, Dale, let that sink in, 94% of the crashes that were submitted for them to review were found to be non-preventable. The federal government stepped in and said there was nothing the motor carrier could have done to keep this crash from happening. So with those kind of phenomenal results, they shifted gears in July of 2019 and to present and made the pilot program into a permanent program. Effective actually August 1st of 2019, and it's still running today. Whereas they originally looked at 8 different types of crashes, they upped that to 16 different types of crashes that they'll now look at. A motor carrier can submit a request for a review through the data queue system in the FMCSA portal, and FMCSA will look at the crash, and they will either issue a ruling that this crash was preventable, it was non-preventable, or they will say it doesn't meet the criteria for the program. Now, to date, still looking at the number that they've looked at, the success rate for motor carriers is still over 94%. which means 94 of every 100 that are submitted for review are found to actually be non-preventable. That is, in the motor carrier's favor. Now, if they get ruled in the favor of the motor carrier, several good things happen for the trucking industry. Number one, the crash is not used in the calculation of your crash basic in the CSA. It will not be used by an auditor when they come in to calculate your accident frequency. And something important for a driver is it will show up on the driver's PSP, the pre-employment review program, as being a non-preventable crash. Now, the crash doesn't go away. There's a myth about that. It still remains on there because DOT says the reason we collect this data is to just collect data. We want to know how many crashes there are out there. The problem was how the data was being used once it was posted to the public site. So now what we get is a stamp basically on the motor carrier's website that the federal government says this was a non-preventable crash, and very beneficial for our industry.
You know, and really, I think most of the carriers in that 94% presented them when they were non-preventable, right? I mean, if they were genuinely at fault, they're not going to submit a challenge, is what we like to call it, a challenge on the ruling if we were at fault or had been ticketed for it. But if it truly was an accident that's non-preventable, that's when the carrier needs some relief, and that's when they went for it. And I think that's the reason for the success rate. Don't you agree, Kenny?
Absolutely. And in fact, Dave, you hit a tremendous point. I do a lot of teaching. Y'all both know this. I do a lot of teaching across the country, and this is one of the subjects I teach on. And I always admonish as sternly as I possibly can for a motor carrier not to submit a crash if there is the least indication that they were at fault, that it was a preventable crash, if the trooper shows any kind of remarks in contributing factors of the driver. Because know this, if the crash that a motor carrier submits to the program fits the criteria of the program, it's one of those 16 types, you do everything right, FMCSA is going to issue a ruling. Now, we want that ruling to be non-preventable, but they will issue preventable. So think about that. If 94% of them have been ruled as non-preventable, that means 6% of them have been actually ruled by the federal government as being preventable. They post that on their website. So heaven forbid why a trucking company would want the federal government to publicly put on a website, yeah, you had a crash, and yes, it was preventable. It basically takes away any defense you would ever have in any sort of litigation. So it is much better not to submit one to the program than to submit one that you absolutely know ahead of time you're going to lose.
Hey, Kenny, that is great information there. So can you tell us a little bit what types are challengeable, which ones we go after?
Yeah, and Dale, the easiest thing for any of your listeners, for motor carriers, drivers, to do, for y'all to do, is to go to the FMCSA Crash Preventability. They have their own website. You can just get on Google, whatever search engine you use, and type in FMCSA Crash Preventability Determination Program, and it'll bring you to the website. And this is one time where the federal government, the educational material that they developed is very, very good. Whoever did it did a really good job. And they have a guide of how to submit the challenge, that use the term Dave used. It tells how to actually go in and submit the data queue. And then they have a guide to the 16 different types of crashes. And one thing neat, they put a little diagram of each one of them, the different types. For instance, if y'all had a truck sitting at a red light or a stop sign doing absolutely nothing wrong, the driver is simply sitting there waiting for the light to turn green, or it's his turn to go at the stop sign, and a four-wheeler runs into the back of the trailer. And there was nothing the driver could do. He had nowhere to go. He couldn't stop the other car. He couldn't do anything. There's a diagram within this material that they developed that shows those type of crashes. And there's a diagram for all 16 of them. I mean, they range everything from striking an animal on the highway to certain kinds of debris in the road. If you're driving down an interstate highway and a car comes off of an entrance ramp or runs into the side of the trailer, they're all listed. All 16 of the kind are listed. Now, I want to tell y'all, while we're talking about these 16 types, FMCSA is absolutely dogmatic to the point of zero variability of deviating from these 16 types. It has to fit absolutely perfectly. This, in my opinion, is still the one weakness of the program, is because there are some crashes out there that, number one, they're not the fault of the motor carrier. They also are non-preventable, but because they don't precisely fit, exactly fit one of those 16 types, FMCSA simply rejects the challenge and says this crash is not considered for preventability because it doesn't meet the guidelines. We're hoping, now think about this, in the pilot program they looked at 8 types, we're now up to 16. We hope that as the federal government, gets more and more comfortable with how they're issuing these rulings and how they're making these determinations, we're hoping that they will add additional categories, because there's some more that need to be added that right now simply aren't. So the easiest thing to do, short of just going down that, and I can go down the list for you, but there's some other things I'd rather share with you, but it's easiest just to get on the website and look at the 16 types. They even give you examples of crashes that fit that type and crashes that don't. They have a column with a green check in it, and they have a column with a red X in it. And so it tells you, don't submit these kind. We're not even going to look at them. These are the kind we will submit. But it's the classic things you think of. A truck sitting at a red light getting run into the back, a truck having the right of way through an intersection and a car slamming into it at the side. Those sorts of things that everybody would readily identify as being, non-preventable crashes. The problem is in the details, because a trooper, what you'll always need to do is look at the crash report and read what the narrative says, look at the diagram in the crash report, always look at the segment that shows contributing factors, make sure they didn't put any contributing factor on your driver. And it's just a very, very careful analysis of the crash report that you have versus that document. And I want to tell y'all, that document is really important, even to the point, and y'all know I'm sitting on the side of the road in my car. I'm out working today, but I keep I just keep a copy of it with me all the time. It's about a 10-page document, and it's got all the diagrams of the pictures. And this document is so handy that I keep it with me all the time in case a client calls and says, hey, we're thinking about challenging this crash. Does it fit the program? And I'll look in there and see. So the FMCSA did a really good job designing the educational material that goes along with this program.
Did you, and as you deal and as you educate, and I know a lot of people are putting in, but I'll tell you, I think, Kenny, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot don't really know that you can challenge, right? I mean, you meet and talk to individuals in the trucking industry that aren't aware of this when you first meet first make their acquaintance, correct?
Absolutely, Dave. And that's one of the reasons I was so proud when you and Rick and BCB kicked this program off in its infancy, BCB Live. And when you have Bob and Dale on there, I just, because there's a lot of people other than your employees, your drivers, your customers that listen to this program. And so I always, every time y'all ask me to be a part of it, I'm grateful y'all have asked me several times to be your guest. I always use that as a platform to educate people. This is never about Kenny Ray. It's always about the topic that we're talking about. And you're right. I cover all of Texas and all of Oklahoma for my company, and I come across companies all the time, good motor carriers, that don't even realize this program exists. And it's been highly publicized. It's in all of the trade journals. And again, I go back to my opening statement. This is one of the things the federal government did that is very, very good for our industry. And the fact that 94% of the properly submitted challenges are being found to be non-preventable in the favor of the motor carrier, it's a travesty that we're not using this tool more. Because it really will help a company, and it helps a company in very practical ways. On that CSA score on their crash basic, on crashes being eliminated from consideration during an audit, and for their drivers having the notation placed on their PSP that this was a non-preventable crash. So it's really, really important that more motor carriers utilize this program, but it's equally important to know that they only need to submit the ones that they know absolutely will not be ruled against them. Those are the ones that, you know, when the program first came out, I heard some very arrogant people in this industry say, well, I'm going to challenge every single one of them. That's a terrible idea. Because if your driver was at fault, if there were things your driver could have done to prevent this crash, and I hope we'll take, and I know you've got time constraints, I hope y'all will let me explain the difference between at fault and preventability, but if a company knows that the crash was preventable, they don't need to submit, because this actually will hurt you. I mean, you don't want the federal government ruling that you were involved in a crash that you could have prevented. That's a kiss of death on your insurance premiums, and it's a kiss of death on any litigation in case you're sued.
Yeah, you can. We preach and we talk about preventability and fault and at fault. And go ahead, Kenny. Just go ahead and talk us through it so that everybody understands about how. Because we also talk about how important it is about preventability and about at fault. Because we believe the mindset of the driver should always want to prevent an accident whenever possible. It doesn't matter if you have the right of way. You want to prevent the accident and do everything that you can to prevent. I don't care if you have right of way. I want you to do everything you can to not, if you got to yield right of way to stop an accident, that's what you should do. And I think you should explain right now in insurance terms preventability versus at fault.
Yeah, and Dave, you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, you did as good an explanation as I could. And we're all around truck drivers all the time, and most people know, because I've been on your program enough, but if they don't, I'm the son of a truck driver, and I've got two little brothers that are driving as we speak. Even though I'm a retired state trooper, I'm as pro this industry. I eat, live, and breathe trucking. I love it with all my heart. But y'all know, every single time that we have a driver involved in a crash, the very first words out of that driver's mouth almost always are, "It wasn't my fault." And we need to understand this program we're talking about today has nothing to do with fault. It has to do with preventability. And fault is a legal term. That's something the law enforcement's looking to decide who caused this accident that I can take enforcement action again. I can write a ticket against. Preventability is a much higher standard. Preventability, in fact, the National Safety Council defines preventability, and they say this. They say it's a collision. A preventable crash is a collision in which a driver failed to do everything reasonable to prevent that crash. Now, I often ask trucking companies when I go in and do an audit or teach for their drivers, I'll say, is there a way we can eliminate all truck crashes? The answer to that is actually yes, we can. We can park every one of these trucks on a yard and not move any freight, and we will have no truck crashes. We'll have no truck crashes. But that's not a reasonable move, okay? So a reasonable move, I'll give you a classic example, and I'll make this really, really quick because I know we're coming up on our time, but y'all picture the Texas Panhandle where you can just see forever. And you've got a truck on a 4-lane U.S. highway, not an interstate because interstates have controlled access and exit, but a 4-lane U.S. highway where you have state and county roads intersecting the highway. You got a driver that's a truck driver on that 4-lane highway, and off to his right, he sees a county or a state FM road that's going to intersect that, and he sees a 4-wheeler blasting down that road, okay? Now, that truck driver, because he or she's experienced out here every day, can gauge speeds on cars just as well as the highway patrol can. And that driver says, you know what? that car is going to get to that intersection at exactly same time I'm going to get to that intersection. I have the right of way. He's got a stop sign. So if the truck driver did nothing but just kept on going, proper speed, his hours of service is good, equipment's in good shape, and that idiot runs that stop sign and goes under that truck and dies, everyone would agree the truck driver wasn't at fault. The truck driver had the right of way. But was that crash preventable? Most people would say yes. The driver could have backed off the cruise control. He could have tapped the brakes. It wouldn't have taken much change in his speed to that guy may still run that stop sign, but he run it right in front of the truck and goes across and ends up in a cotton field in the panhandle. But so the difference between fault and preventability is enormous. And what this program judges or makes a determination of, was the crash preventable? So they always look at factors way beyond fault as to whether or not the driver could have done anything reasonable to keep the crash from happening.
You know, and I think I like the fact that I get that they make that determination. However, also, Kenny, I think it's important to know that we all have that responsibility. Every single one of us behind the wheel needs to understand that if we want to make a difference not only in this industry, but we want to make a difference between how all those people die on the roads, we've got to understand we have an opportunity to be better at being better at preventability than we are at fault, because fault can be easily, I mean, that's not really where it matters, right?
No, it's about being preventable. It's about doing everything reasonable to prevent that accident.
And I think that's important. But that's not what this program does or says. This program is to measure preventability on any accident with a challenge in place. I think one of my favorites, Kenny, is this one: rare or unusual type of crash when the CMV was involved in a crash set type that seldom occurs and is not eligible in any of the other types. That's kind of.
And Dave, you and Dale both know truck drivers encounter some weird stuff out on the road. I mean, there's even been occasions where a vehicle, and not always an 18-wheeler, but sometimes a vehicle be going down the highway, and something like a skydiver, a guy with a parachute that got blown off course, lands in the highway or hits the car, or, I mean, just bizarre, weird things happening. So FMCSA put that category in there for any kind of odd, strange, weird stuff like that. But, and I know we're to the end. I want to wrap up on an encouraging note. Even though the standard for this program is preventability, which is a higher standard than fault, we all agree with that.
Agreed.
Just know that still 94% of these crashes that are being submitted to this program, when they're properly submitted, are being ruled in favor of the trucking company. This is good news for our industry. None of us want to see crashes. I wish I could wave a magic wand and make them all go away. But the fact is, when they occur and they are non-preventable on the motor carrier's part, we now have a mechanism in place to get a little bit of relief from some of that scrutiny that our industry is under because of these crashes.
Do you anticipate, Kenny, and I'm going to ask, do you anticipate that the number will increase from 16 to a greater number? Because I know some of the instances like side swiping on the side of in a lane, that's not allowable under the ruling. But do you anticipate that this will encompass more and be a greater scope in the near future?
I do, and I hope that occurs. FMCSA getting a lot of pressure from industry to add to these categories. They've been pretty resistant to this point. They're still using COVID as an excuse, saying, our people are still working from home, we're overloaded, we can't take on anything else right now. They can't hire enough qualified people to actually do the reviews. But at some point, I think because based on the success of this program, at some point they're going to have to open it up, because there's some crashes, Dave, that you just said occur that they absolutely clearly were non-preventable on behalf of the motor carrier, and we can't even submit them for review because they don't meet one of those very rigid 16 categories. So my hope is that happens. So far, they've been resistant of doing that.
And by the way, I'm just going to ask real quick, where do the determinations are displayed on any and all? Because this is all public information, correct, Kenny? When a crash is deemed non-preventable, it's public information, correct?
Yeah, and where you access that through the SAFER system, there now will be, where it shows up the crashes, there now will simply be a notation there that it was ruled non-preventable by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety. And I've actually already seen some of the PSPs the drivers get. So when y'all are hiring drivers and, it shows that driver had a crash in the past, I've seen now the notations on the PSP where not only did the motor carrier receive the favorable ruling, but the driver that was in that truck, it still shows up on his PSP, but there's now a notation. And again, I can't tell you how important that's a stamp of approval, if you will, from the federal government that, hey, this driver he did nothing that contributed to this crash. So it's both on the posting, the public posting for the motor carrier, and the PSP for the driver.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Hey, and as always, I appreciate you coming on and talking a little bit. The next time that we invite you on, I want you to come in studio. I'd love to see you here in studio.
I'll do it. Dave and Dale, y'all are two of my favorite folks. Tell Bob hello. Tell Rick I said hello. And Miss Bryce for putting it all together. Thank y'all for having me.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kenny.
Thank you, Kenny.